General George S. Patton, a man not known for giving credit to scientists or civilians, stood looking over the frozen carnage of the Ardennes battlefield in early 1945. He watched the cleanup crews removing the shattered remains of elite German panzer grenadiers from the foxholes. He turned to his aide and said something that would be classified for months. "The Funny Fuze won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." Patton was talking about a device smaller than a pint of milk, a device that looked like a simple metal nose cone, but contained a secret so potent that for 2 years, the Allies were terrified to use it in Europe, fearing that if a single unexploded shell fell into German hands, the Luftwaffe could copy it and wipe out the Allied bomber fleets in a month. But on December 16, 1944, the secret was unleashed, and for the German soldier it was the end of the world. Let's go to that moment, the Ardennes forest, Belgium, the ghost front. It is the coldest winter in recorded European history. The temperature has plummeted to -20 degrees Celsius. The ground is harder than concrete. The pine trees are coated in heavy ice. Private First Class Hans Müller of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend is confident. He is young, fanatical, and for the first time in years he feels like he is winning. The massive German counteroffensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, has caught the Americans completely by surprise. For 3 days, a heavy blanket of grey fog has grounded the Allied Air Force. The terrified American Jabos, the P-47 Thunderbolts, are stuck on the runways in England and France. Without their air cover, the American infantry is crumbling. They are retreating, leaving behind smoking Shermans and piles of equipment. Hans and his unit are advancing on the Elsenborn Ridge, the vital shoulder of the American defense. They are dug in deep. The veterans have taught Hans the rules of survival against American artillery. The armies have endless ammunition, but they rely on impact fuses. When you hear the whistle, dive deep. The shell will hit the frozen ground and explode upwards. If you keep your head down, the earth absorbs the shrapnel. You will survive. That advice, which had kept German infantry alive from Normandy to the German border, was about to become a death sentence. Suddenly, the low rumble of heavy artillery rolls across the valley. It is the distinct deep bass of the American 155mm Long Tom battalions, firing from miles away. The sound is continuous, a rolling thunder that shakes the snow from the trees. Hans dives into his foxhole. He curls into a ball, hands over his helmet, waiting for the ground impacts. He waits for the earth to shake. But the shells don't hit the ground. 20 meters above the forest floor, directly over the heads of the attacking German formations, the air rips apart. There is no impact crater. There is no delay, just a sudden violent detonation in mid-air. The physics of this explosion are horrifyingly different. When a shell explodes on contact with the ground, nearly half of its energy digs a hole in the dirt. The shrapnel flies upward in a V shape. A soldier lying flat is relatively safe. But when a shell explodes 20 meters in the air, the shrapnel expands downward in a perfect cone of destruction. There is no shadow to hide in. The red-hot steel fragments, moving at supersonic speeds, scour the foxholes like a broom. And in the Ardennes, the environment turns against the Germans. The dense pine forest, which usually offers cover, becomes a force multiplier. The air-bursting shells snap the massive trees like matchsticks. The air is filled not just with steel, but with jagged wooden splinters, thousands of them, acting like medieval arrows. In seconds, entire German platoons are erased. Commanders looking through binoculars are baffled. They see no craters. They see no missed shots. They see a wall of fire hanging in the air, moving methodically across their lines. It is as if the Americans have developed a way to detonate the very atmosphere. Hans Müller never knew what killed him. The inspection teams that found his unit days later found men dead in their foxholes without a single mark on them, killed instantly by the overpressure of the blast, or riddled with shrapnel from an angle that physics said was impossible. The German offensive at Elsenborn Ridge didn't just stop, it evaporated. The survivors who were captured were trembling, asking their captors the same question. What is that new shelling? It follows us into the holes. They had just met the VT Fuze, the variable time fuse, or, as the scientists back in the United States called it, the Proximity Fuze. To understand why this moment was a technological miracle, we have to understand the nightmare of 1940. We have to go back to the Battle of Britain, where the desperation of the Allies revealed a fatal flaw in modern warfare. In 1940, the Luftwaffe was pounding London. Night after night, German bombers flew over British cities. On the ground, thousands of anti-aircraft guns fired millions of shells into the sky. The night sky was lit up with tracers. It looked impressive in newsreels, but statistically it was a failure. The math was depressing. To shoot down a single high-flying German bomber in 1940, British gunners had to fire an average of 20,000 shells. 20,000. Think about the industrial cost, the metal, the explosives, the shipping, the wear on the gun barrels, all to destroy one plane. The problem was geometry. An anti-aircraft shell had to actually hit the plane to destroy it. But a bomber at 20,000 feet looks like a speck. It is moving at 300 miles per hour. The shell takes 10 to 15 seconds to get there. By the time the shell arrives, the plane has moved 2 miles. The only alternative was the time fuse. This was a clockwork mechanism inside the nose of the shell. The gunner would calculate the range, say the bomber is 18,000 feet away. He sets the timer for exactly 12.5 seconds. If the shell explodes at 12.5 seconds, and the math is perfect, the shrapnel shreds the plane. But in the chaos of war, perfection is a myth. If the timer is off by just 1/10 of a second, the shell travels an extra 200 feet. It explodes harmlessly past the target. If the fuse is set 1/10 of a second too early, it explodes in front of the target. Gunners were trying to hit a bullet with another bullet in the dark while being bombed. It was hopeless. The scientists knew the solution. It was theoretically simple. They didn't need a bigger gun. They needed a smarter shell. They needed a shell that didn't rely on math or timers. They needed a shell that knew when it was close to the target. They needed a shell that carried its own radar station. It sounded perfect. It also sounded impossible. In late 1940, a secret delegation from Great Britain arrived in Washington, D.C. This was the famous Tizard mission. Britain was bankrupt, besieged, and desperate. They brought with them a black metal box containing their most guarded technological secrets, hoping to trade them for American industrial support. Inside that box was the cavity magnetron, the key to high-power radar. But they also brought a request. They asked the American National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, if they could build a radio proximity fuse. The American experts looked at the specifications and laughed. "You want to put a radio transmitter and a receiver inside a 5-inch shell?" one engineer asked. "Do you know what happens inside a gun barrel?" Let's look at the violence of artillery physics. When a 155mm or 5-inch naval gun is fired, the shell accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in a fraction of a second. The force of that acceleration is 20,000 Gs. That means a component weighing 1 ounce suddenly weighs 20,000 ounces, or 1,200 pounds, for a split second. But that's not the worst part. To stabilize the shell in flight, the gun barrel is rifled. The shell spins. It spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute. The centrifugal force is so strong that it would rip a standard copper wire apart. It would liquefy a battery. And in 1940, there were no microchips, no transistors. Electronics were made of vacuum tubes, delicate glass bulbs with tiny filaments inside, like light bulbs. The British were asking the Americans to take a glass light bulb, shoot it out of a cannon with the force of a car crash, spin it at the speed of a jet turbine, and have it not only survive, but turn on, transmit a radio signal, listen for the echo off an airplane, and detonate the explosive at the exact millisecond of closest approach. It was akin to asking someone to throw a functioning radio set off the Empire State Building and expect it to play music before it hit the ground. Most electronics companies said it couldn't be done. They said the laws of physics prevented it. But one man, Dr. Merle Tuve of the Carnegie Institution, disagreed. He formed a new division, known simply as Section T. He recruited a motley crew of physicists, astronomers, and radio enthusiasts. They took over a garage at Johns Hopkins University. Their motto was, "I don't want the best fuse in the world. I want the first one that works, and I want it yesterday." The challenge was monumental. They had to reinvent electronics from scratch. They had to build ruggedized vacuum tubes. They tested them by dropping them off buildings onto concrete. They fired them from crude air cannons into steel plates. They realized that standard batteries would leak or break under the G-force. So they had to invent a battery that didn't exist until the gun was fired. A battery that used the shock of the launch to break a glass ampule of acid, activating the plates instantly. For 2 years, Section T worked in total secrecy. They blew up thousands of tubes. They failed over and over again. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the US Navy was bleeding. The Japanese Zero fighters and dive bombers were decimating the fleet. The standard anti-aircraft guns were struggling. The sailors watched the skies praying for a miracle, while back in a Maryland laboratory, a group of civilians was trying to teach a bullet how to think. The breakthrough, when it came, would change the face of war forever. But it would also create a new dilemma. Now that we have the ultimate weapon, do we dare use it? 1941, Silver Spring, Maryland. Inside a converted garage known as the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of burnt ozone. Dr. Merle Tuve and his team of Section T scientists were staring at a pile of shattered glass. They had just fired another prototype vacuum tube out of a 37mm gun test barrel. It had failed. The filaments had snapped. The glass envelope had cracked. The cynicism of the military establishment seemed justified. You simply cannot fire a radio set out of a cannon. But Tuve was stubborn. He knew that the problem wasn't just the G-force, it was the vibration. The harmonics inside a gun barrel were violent enough to turn solid metal into jelly. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, the hearing aid industry. In the 1930s, companies like Raytheon and Sylvania had begun developing sub-miniature vacuum tubes for portable hearing aids. These tubes were tiny, the size of a fingertip, and they were robust. They weren't designed for artillery, but they were a start. Section T took these tiny tubes and encased them in wax. Then they encased the wax in plastic. They created a potted circuit, a solid block of resin where the delicate electronics were suspended like a fly in amber. When they fired these new ruggedized tubes, they survived. The radio could survive the launch, but then they hit the second wall, the battery. A proximity fuse needs power. It needs electricity to send out the radar wave. Standard dry cell batteries, like the ones in your flashlight, had 2 fatal flaws. First, they were fragile. Second, and more importantly, they had a shelf life. A battery sitting in a warehouse in the humid Pacific for 6 months loses its charge. You couldn't have a battleship reach for ammo in the middle of a Japanese air raid, only to find the batteries were dead. The solution they engineered was a masterpiece of violent chemistry. They invented the reserve battery, or wet battery. Inside the fuse, the plates of the battery were dry and inert. They could sit on a shelf for 10 years and never lose power. In the center of the battery was a tiny glass ampule filled with liquid electrolyte, acid. This ampule was designed to break only under a specific force, 20,000 Gs. Think about the elegance of this. The battery was dead until the exact moment the gun was fired. When the powder charge exploded in the breech, the massive acceleration slammed the ampule against a breaker. The glass shattered. The centrifugal force of the spinning shell, 25,000 RPM, forced the acid outward, coating the plates. In less than 1/10 of a second, while the shell was still traveling down the barrel, the battery woke up, generated voltage, and powered the radar. By the time the shell left the muzzle, it was alive. Now the shell had a brain and a heart. But how did it see? The VT fuse didn't work like a traditional radar screen with a sweeping arm. It was far simpler and more brilliant. It used the Doppler effect. The nose of the shell emitted a continuous radio wave. As the shell flew through empty space, the signal went out and never came back. But if the shell passed near an object, like a Japanese Zero fighter, the radio wave would bounce off the metal plane and reflect back to the shell. Because the shell was moving at supersonic speed relative to the plane, the returning wave was compressed, just as the sound of a train whistle changes pitch as it passes you. The fuse compared the outgoing signal with the incoming signal. When the two signals interfered with each other to create a specific beat frequency, which indicated the target was roughly 70 feet away, a thyrotron switch tripped. An electrical spark fired the detonator. The shell exploded. It didn't need to hit the plane. It just needed to be near the plane. The warhead would shred everything within a 50-yard radius. By the summer of 1942, Section T was ready to prove the impossible. They invited high-ranking Navy admirals to the Chesapeake Bay. They launched a target drone, a remote-controlled airplane over the water. The cruiser USS Cleveland was waiting. In previous tests with standard ammo, gunners would fire hundreds of rounds and maybe scratch the drone. The Cleveland fired one burst with the new VT fuses. The very first shell detected the drone, exploded 50 feet away, and knocked it out of the sky. The admirals were stunned. One officer reportedly asked, "Do we have enough of these, because this changes everything?" Production began immediately. But it wasn't just one factory. It was a nationwide secret effort. Crosley, famous for radios, built the chassis. Sylvania built the tubes. Kodak assembled parts. At its peak, the VT Fuze project employed 80,000 people, mostly women, whose dexterity was preferred for the microscopic assembly work. It cost nearly $1 billion in 1940s money. It was comparable in scale and secrecy to the Manhattan Project. The combat debut came on January 5, 1943, in the South Pacific. The light cruiser USS Helena, CL-50, was patrolling near Guadalcanal. A flight of Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers appeared on the radar, intent on sinking the American task force. The gunnery officer on the Helena ordered the loading of the new Mark 32 shells, the code name for the VT Fuze. The Japanese pilots were confident. They were used to American anti-aircraft fire being heavy, but inaccurate. They knew the rhythm: dive, drop, pull out. The flak usually exploded behind them. The lead Japanese bomber began its dive. The Helena's 5-inch guns roared. Usually the crew would fire a continuous stream of shells, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke, hoping for a lucky hit. This time, they fired 2 salvos. The first shell flew up to meet the diving Val. It didn't hit the plane. It exploded just off the starboard wing. The shrapnel tore the wing off. The bomber disintegrated instantly, tumbling into the sea in a ball of fire. The second bomber was hit seconds later. The attack was over before it began. On the deck of the Helena, there was confusion. The gun crews were standing ready to reload, but the order to cease fire came almost immediately. "Where is the rest of the ammo?" a sailor asked. "Did the guns jam?" "No," the officer replied, looking through his binoculars at the burning wreckage on the water. "We hit them. We hit them all." The efficiency was terrifying. With traditional ammo, it took 2,000 to 3,000 rounds to down a plane, an improvement over the Battle of Britain, but still high. With the VT Fuze, the Navy found they were shooting down planes with an average of 500 rounds. Later in the war, that number dropped to less than 100. The Japanese pilots couldn't understand it. They reported back that the Americans had developed a new super-aiming system, or that their gunners had become supernatural sharpshooters. They never suspected the shells themselves were watching them. As the VT Fuze spread to the rest of the fleet, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted permanently. The terrifying kamikaze attacks of 1944 and 1945 were met with a wall of steel that was mathematically impossible to penetrate. The divine wind was stopped by the smart shell, but this success created a massive strategic dilemma for the Allies, a problem known as the Golden Handcuffs. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, looked at the reports from the Pacific and made a cold calculation. The VT Fuze was too good. If they used it over land, in North Africa, Italy, or France, there was a 100% certainty that eventually a shell would be fired, fail to explode, duds are inevitable, and land in the mud intact. If German engineers recovered a VT Fuze, they would disassemble it. They would see the vacuum tubes, they would understand the radar principle. Germany had excellent scientists. They would be able to copy it in 6 months. The thought terrified the Allied High Command. If the Luftwaffe got VT Fuses for their 88mm flak guns, the American B-17 and British Lancaster bomber fleets would be wiped out. The strategic bombing campaign would end. The invasion of Europe, D-Day, would become impossible. So, a strict order was issued. The VT Fuze is restricted to naval use over open water only. Under no circumstances is it to be fired over land where recovery by the enemy is possible. This order saved the strategic bombing campaign, but it condemned thousands of Allied infantrymen to death. In the mountains of Italy and the hedgerows of Normandy, American artillerymen were forced to use the old, inefficient mechanical time fuses. They struggled to kill German infantry dug into trenches. They watched their friends die in attacks that could have been supported by the god of war, but the weapon was locked away in crates marked top secret. The secret was kept for 2 agonizing years. But by late 1944, the situation changed. The Germans launched the V1 flying bombs against London. The Allied armies were stalled at the German border. And in the Ardennes, Hitler was massing his panzers for one last great offensive. The calculation of risk was about to shift. The golden handcuffs were about to be taken off, and the Wehrmacht had no idea what was about to fall on their heads. June 13, 1944. While Allied troops were fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, a new sound was heard over the streets of London. It was a coarse, guttural buzzing, like a giant motorcycle engine in the sky. Londoners, hardened by the Blitz of 1940, looked up to see a small, pilotless aircraft cruising at 400 miles per hour. Suddenly the engine cut out. A terrifying silence followed, then a massive explosion that leveled a city block. Hitler had unleashed the V1 flying bomb, the Vergeltungswaffe, retaliation weapon. It was the world's first cruise missile. The V1 presented a nightmare for British air defenses. It was too fast for most fighter planes to catch. It flew too low for heavy radar to track effectively. And it was a small target, barely 25 feet wide. The British anti-aircraft guns ringing London fired frantically. But once again, they were limited by the mechanical time fuses. The gunners tried to guess the range. They set their timers. But the V1s were fast and small. Thousands of shells exploded harmlessly behind the flying bombs. In the first weeks of the V1 campaign, only a fraction were shot down. Morale in London began to crack. Desperate, Prime Minister Winston Churchill appealed to the Americans. He knew about the secret Section T project. He knew the US Navy had a shell that didn't miss. But the golden handcuffs order was still in effect. Do not use over land. However, the geography of England offered a loophole. The V1s were coming from launch sites in France flying across the English Channel. General George Marshall and the combined chiefs of staff made a calculated decision. They would allow the VT Fuze to be used by anti-aircraft batteries stationed on the southeast coast of England. The reasoning was simple. If a shell missed and didn't explode, it would fall into the ocean, sinking to the bottom where German engineers couldn't recover it. In mid-July 1944, the new shells, codenamed Posit to confuse spies, arrived at the British batteries. The effect was immediate and statistical. Before the VT Fuze, the British gunners averaged 2,500 shells fired to destroy one V1. With the VT Fuze, coupled with new radar-guided directors, that number dropped to 150 shells per kill. By the end of August, the coastal batteries were shooting down nearly 80% of all V1s approaching England. The buzz bomb threat was neutralized not by pilots, but by glass tubes inside artillery shells. The secret was safe, for now. But the war was moving fast. By late 1944, the Allies had captured the vital port of Antwerp in Belgium. This port was the lifeline of the Allied armies. Fuel, food, and ammunition for millions of men had to flow through it. Hitler knew this. He turned his V1 launchers away from London and aimed them at Antwerp. Suddenly, the golden handcuffs tightened again. Antwerp was inland. If they used the VT Fuze to defend the port, duds would fall on Belgian soil. German spies or sympathizers could find one. The debate at Supreme Headquarters, Chef, was furious. On one side, the intelligence officers argued that protecting the secret was paramount to winning the air war. On the other side, logistics generals argued that if Antwerp was destroyed, the Allied armies would run out of gas and the war would be lost anyway. The logistics won. The VT Fuze was authorized for the defense of Antwerp. It was a massacre of missiles. On one single day, German launchers fired 91 V1s at the port. American gunners using the VT Fuze shot down 89 of them. The port remained open. But the final barrier remained. The fuse was still strictly forbidden for use by field artillery. It could be used to shoot up at planes, where duds fall randomly, but it could not be used to shoot down at German soldiers, where duds would land right in enemy lines. American artillerymen in the Hürtgen forest and at Aachen were furious. They were fighting a grinding war of attrition. They fired their 105mm and 155mm howitzers using old-fashioned impact fuses. They watched their shells hit the mud. They saw German infantry survive bombardments by simply digging deeper. They knew the Funny Fuze existed. They knew it could detonate 20 meters above the ground, spraying shrapnel into the trenches. But they weren't allowed to have it. Then came December 16th, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. The German counteroffensive shattered the American lines. Two panzer armies poured through the Ardennes Gap. The weather grounded the Allied Air Force. The situation was critical. There was a genuine fear that the Germans could reach the Meuse River, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. In his headquarters at Versailles, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the grim maps. He needed a force multiplier. He needed something to stop the German infantry masses that were swarming over the American positions. His chief of artillery, Major General Henry Saylor, presented the option. They had stockpiles of VT fuses in France, waiting for the final drive into Germany, planned for 1945. Release them, Eisenhower ordered. The intelligence officers protested. If the Germans capture a dud, the B-17s are doomed. Eisenhower reportedly replied, "If we lose the Ardennes, we won't need B-17s because we will have lost the war." On December 19th, the trucks began rolling. Crates marked "Posit, handle with care" were rushed to the 155-meter Long Tom battalions and the 105mm howitzer batteries facing the German spearhead. The instructions to the gunners were simple, but strange. Set your elevation. Do not set a time fuse. Just screw this nose on and fire, aim for the treetops. Let's return to the German perspective, to the frozen foxholes of the Elsenborn Ridge. The German Volksgrenadiers and SS troopers were exhausted but confident. They were holding the line. They were dug in. The forest was their friend. The thick pine canopy hid them from observation. The frozen ground acted as armor. When the American barrage began, it sounded normal at first. The distant thump of the guns, the whistle of the shells. German veterans yelled, "Deckung!" Cover. Men dove to the bottom of their holes. They curled up, expecting the ground to shake. But the shaking never came. Instead, a hellish cracking sound erupted above them. The VT fuses, sensing the reflection of the radar waves off the ground, detonated exactly 20 meters in the air. The result was a cone of steel rain. Standard artillery is about 15% effective against dug-in troops. VT artillery is 70% to 80% effective. The lethality jump was not incremental. It was exponential. The shrapnel didn't fly out sideways. It came straight down. It entered the open tops of the foxholes. It pierced helmets and shoulders. Worse, the fuses sensed the trees as solid objects. The shells exploded at treetop height, shattering the frozen wood. Imagine standing in a forest while giant shotguns are fired from the sky, mixing steel bullets with millions of wooden daggers. German attacks that had been ferociously pressing forward suddenly dissolved. Entire companies were wiped out in minutes. One German prisoner of war, a veteran of the Russian front, told his interrogators, "I have survived the Katyusha rockets. I have survived the carpet bombing. But this hellfire that follows you into the hole, there is no survival. It is butchery," General Patton wrote in his diary on January 4th, 1945. "The new fuse is devastating. The Germans are scared to death. They are afraid to move. It has completely stopped their infantry attacks. The golden handcuffs were off. The secret was out." But the VT fuse was just one part of the equation. To truly break the Wehrmacht, the Americans combined this new technology with a tactical doctrine that was equally terrifying, a technique that required mathematical precision and radio coordination on a scale never before attempted. They called it TOT, time on target. And when combined with the VT fuse, It meant that an entire square mile of grid coordinates could be erased from existence in a single second. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, sat in a farmhouse cellar used as a command post. He was writing a report to Field Marshal Model. His hand shook as he held the pen. Bayerlein was a veteran of Africa, Russia, and Normandy. He had seen everything modern war could offer, but he was writing about a new phenomenon, something that defied the rules of combat he had learned in the academy. The American artillery, he wrote, is not like the Russian artillery. The Russians fire massive barrages, but they are clumsy. You hear them coming. You have time to duck. The Americans, they are different. Their fire is sudden. It is precise, and it is total. One moment there is silence. The next moment the entire grid square explodes simultaneously. There is no warning. There is no survival. Bayerlein was describing the terrifying effectiveness of a uniquely American doctrine, their tactic that turned artillery from a harassment weapon into an instrument of instant annihilation. They called it TOT, time on target. To understand why TOT was so revolutionary, we have to look at the physics of sound and flight. In World War I, or in the German army of World War II, artillery was fired by battery. 4 guns would fire, then another 4, then another. If you were a soldier on the receiving end, you would hear the distant thump of the first gun. You knew the shell was in the air. You had perhaps 20 or 30 seconds to dive into a trench before the first shell landed. Then the drum fire would begin, a rhythmic pounding. It was terrifying, yes, but it gave you a chance. The Americans changed the math. They realized that the most lethal moment of a bombardment is the first second, when enemy troops are walking in the open, eating lunch or refueling trucks. Once the first shell hits, everyone takes cover, and the effectiveness of subsequent shells drops by 90%. So, the U.S. Army Artillery Corps asked a question. What if every single shell from every single gun in the entire Army Corps arrived at the exact same millisecond? This was a logistical and mathematical nightmare. Imagine a battlefield. Battery A, 105mm howitzers, is 3 miles from the target. Their shells take 15 seconds to fly. Battery B, 155 long toms, is 8 miles from the target. Their shells take 35 seconds to fly. Battery C, 8-inch heavy howitzers, is 12 miles away. Their massive shells take 50 seconds to fly. If they all fire at the word go, the shells arrive one by one over a minute. The surprise is lost. To achieve time on target, you have to work backward from the impact time. If you want everyone to die at exactly 12 Kautalas p.m., Battery C must fire at 11:59:10. Battery B must wait and fire at 11:59:25. Battery A must wait longer and fire at 11:59:45. This requires a centralized brain. It requires the Fire Direction Center, FDC. While German artillery was decentralized, giving freedom to individual battery commanders, American artillery was centralized. All requests for fire went to a central bunker filled with men, cigarette smoke, radios, and slide rules. These men were human computers. They took coordinates from a forward observer, often a pilot in a flimsy Piper Cub plane known as a grasshopper, and instantly calculated the trajectory, wind drift, air density, and flight time for dozens of different batteries. When a TOT mission was called, often codenamed a serenade, the radio net would go silent. The countdown would begin. Across miles of countryside, gun crews watched their stopwatches. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. The heavy guns in the rear fired first. Seconds later, the medium guns fired. Finally, the light guns fired. For the Germans on the receiving end, there was no sound of firing. The speed of sound is slower than the speed of the shells. The target area would be peaceful. Birds singing, soldiers playing cards. Then the sky would simply tear open. Hundreds of shells ranging from 105mm to 240 equipped with the terrifying VT Proximity Fuses, would detonate at the exact same instant, 20 meters above the ground. The overpressure alone could liquefy organs. The shrapnel saturation was 100%. In one documented instance near the Rhine, A German column of 200 vehicles was hit by a corps serenade. Observers reported that 1 minute the column was moving, the next minute every single vehicle was burning, and not a single human figure was left standing. It was an eraser. This industrial application of death broke the back of the German resistance in the West. But while the VT Fuze and TOT were dismantling the Wehrmacht in Europe, they were facing a very different test on the other side of the world. Okinawa, April 1945. The Typhoon of Steel. The war in the Pacific was different. The Japanese Imperial Army did not fight like the Germans. The Germans surrendered when surrounded. The Japanese fought to the death. The Germans maneuvered. The Japanese dug. On Okinawa, the Japanese 32nd Army had constructed the Shuri Line, a network of underground fortresses, caves, and tunnels that made the Maginot Line look like a sandbox. The U.S. Navy and Marines unleashed the full fury of the VT Fuze on this island. It was here that the golden handcuffs were completely forgotten. There was no fear of the Japanese copying the technology. Their industry was already burning. The Japanese tactic was the banzai charge, or the infiltration attack. They would wait in their spider holes until the Marines passed, then swarm them. Or they would launch massive human wave attacks at night. Against standard artillery, these waves were dangerous. Against VT artillery, they were suicide. On the night of April 18th, a Japanese battalion attempted a counterattack against the U.S. 27th Infantry Division. The forward observers called for VT fire. The air above the Japanese charge turned into a wall of glowing red shrapnel. The proximity fuses detected the running men and exploded at head height. The attack didn't just fail, it was vaporized. The next morning, Marines found hundreds of bodies with no craters. The efficiency was so high that some artillery units reported running out of missions because there were simply no targets left in the open. But the VT Fuze had an even more crucial role in the Pacific: suppression. The Japanese defensive doctrine relied on anti-tank guns hidden in caves. When American Sherman tanks advanced, the Japanese would roll out their guns, fire, and roll back in. Standard high-explosive shells were useless against these caves. You had to get a lucky direct hit into the cave mouth. The Americans developed a new tactic. They would fire VT shells set to explode just in front of the cave entrances. The constant rain of supersonic shrapnel forced the Japanese gunners to retreat deep inside the tunnels. They couldn't man their guns. Blind and suppressed, they couldn't stop the American tanks from rolling right up to the cave mouth and unleashing the flamethrowers. The VT Fuze didn't kill the men in the caves directly. It kept their heads down while the flamethrowers came to kill them. It was a brutal synergy of weapons. As the U.S. Navy fleet surrounded Okinawa, they faced the ultimate desperate tactic, the kamikaze. Thousands of Japanese planes were hurled at the fleet, the divine wind. And here the VT Fuze returned to its original purpose, anti-aircraft defense. The skies over Okinawa were filled with black puffs of VT bursts. The destroyers on the radar picket lines, like the USS Laffey, survived attacks that would have sunk them in 1942. The Laffey was hit by 4 bombs and 6 kamikazes, yet she stayed afloat, her guns firing VT shells until the barrels glowed red-hot. By the summer of 1945, the report from the Pacific Command to Washington was clear. Without the VT Fuze, the cost of taking Okinawa might have been double. It is the only thing that stops the mass charges instantly. Back in Europe, the war was ending. The German army had ceased to function as a cohesive force. The terrifying sound of the TOT barrages had driven them across the Rhine and into surrender. But as the Allied armies occupied Germany, intelligence officers rushed to German laboratories. They wanted to know, did the Germans know? Did they know about the secret inside the nose cone? What they found was shocking. They found a few recovered VT fuses sitting on laboratory benches in Berlin. The Germans had found duds in the Ardennes. They had taken them apart. German scientists had looked at the vacuum tubes, they had looked at the batteries, and they had given up. Why? Because the German industrial base was so shattered, and their electronics industry so focused on other projects, like the V2 rocket, that they concluded, it is impossible to mass-produce these vacuum tubes. The Americans must be making them by hand, one by one. It is a trick. They couldn't comprehend the scale of the American war forge. They couldn't imagine that Sylvania and RCA were churning out 40,000 of these impossible tubes per day. The Germans lost not because they lacked the intelligence to understand the fuse, but because they lacked the industrial capacity to believe it was real. As the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific, the VT fuse stood as the supreme example of the Allied way of war. It wasn't a weapon of individual heroism, it was a weapon of mass production, miniaturized electronics, and mathematical calculation. It took the randomness out of killing. It turned the art of artillery into a science of extermination. But the legacy of the VT fuse was not just in the bodies it left behind. Its technology, the miniature ruggedized vacuum tube, would spark a revolution that would lead to the computer age. And the doctrine of time on target would remain the standard for artillery for the next 50 years. In the final part of our series, we will look at the aftermath. We will analyze the cost, the legacy, and how this funny fuse paved the way for the guided missiles of the Cold War. May 1945, the ruins of Berlin. The war in Europe is over. Teams of American intelligence officers, part of Operation Paperclip and the Alsos mission, are scouring the bombed-out laboratories of the Third Reich. They are looking for nuclear secrets, jet engines, and rockets. But one team is looking for something smaller. They want to know the answer to the question that had terrified General Eisenhower for 2 years. Why didn't the Germans copy the VT fuse? They found the answer in a debriefing room with captured German scientists. The Germans admitted they had found unexploded VT shells in the Ardennes in late 1944. They had taken them back to Berlin. They had carefully disassembled them. They had marveled at the miniature vacuum tubes, the shock-resistant batteries, and the complex circuitry. The American interrogator asked, "You understood how it worked. You have brilliant physicists. Why didn't you build your own?" The German scientist shrugged and replied with a statement that perfectly encapsulates the difference between the Axis and the Allies. "We understood the physics, but we looked at the vacuum tubes and concluded they must have been handmade by expert jewelers. We calculated that to equip an army with these would require the entire labor force of Germany just to assemble the tubes. We assumed you had only made a few thousand for special occasions. We simply did not believe it was possible to mass-produce a miracle." They were wrong. The United States hadn't made a few thousand. By VJ Day in August 1945, American factories had produced 22 million VT fuses. This is the final, brutal truth of the war forge. The Germans were fighting a war of craftsmen, where every Tiger tank was a masterpiece. The Americans were fighting a war of commodities, where even the most advanced electronic device in human history was treated as a disposable bullet, churned out like Coca-Cola bottles. The scale of the VT fuse program, officially known as Section T, was staggering. It cost $1.1 billion in 1940s money. To put that in perspective, the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, cost $2 billion. The VT fuse was the second most expensive technology program of the war. It employed 80,000 workers across 300 different factories. But unlike the atomic bomb, which ended the war with 2 singular flashes of horror, the VT fuse won the war incrementally, day by day, shell by shell, in thousands of forgotten foxholes and lonely naval engagements. The legacy of this device goes far beyond the battlefield. If you are watching this video on a smartphone or a computer, you are looking at the direct descendant of the VT fuse. Before the war, electronics were point-to-point. A radio was a bird's nest of wires soldered by hand. It was messy, large, and fragile. To build the VT fuse, Section T needed something smaller and tougher. They couldn't have wires rattling around inside a spinning shell. So they developed a technique involving ceramic plates. They painted the wires onto the plate using conductive silver ink. They painted the resistors using carbon ink. They created a solid, flat, integrated block of electronics. This was the ancestor of the printed circuit board, PCB. After the war, the thousands of engineers who worked on Section T didn't just go home. They took this knowledge of miniaturization into the civilian world. The company Centralab, which made the circuits for the fuses, used the same technology to build the first hearing aids that fit inside an ear. The vacuum tube manufacturers, pushing for smaller and smaller devices, paved the way for the invention of the transistor in 1947. The computer revolution of the 20th century was jump-started by the need to put a radar inside a bullet. Militarily, the VT Fuze changed the philosophy of killing. For 500 years, gunnery was about ballistics, aiming the gun perfectly. The VT Fuze introduced the concept of the smart weapon. You didn't need to be perfect. The weapon would correct your error. In the 1950s, the physicists from the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, took the concept one step further. They thought, the VT shell detects a plane and explodes. What if, instead of exploding, it steered? They replaced the radar proximity sensor with an infrared heat seeker. They replaced the fixed fins with movable fins. The result was the AIM-9 Sidewinder, the first successful air-to-air guided missile. The lineage is direct. The Smart Shell of 1944 is the grandfather of the Tomahawk cruise missile and the Javelin anti-tank rocket of today. As we look back at the carnage of World War II, it is easy to focus on the generals, Patton, Rommel, Zhukov. It is easy to focus on the aces, Wittmann, Bong, Hartmann. But the true victors were the logistical geniuses and the industrial scientists who remained anonymous. General George Patton, in his final assessment of the war, wrote a letter to General Levin Campbell, Chief of Ordnance. In it, he didn't praise his tank crews or his strategists. He praised the fuse. The Funny Fuze won the Battle of the Bulge for us. It is the most devastating killer of men I have ever seen. But perhaps the most poignant verdict comes from the other side. Dr. Walter Dornberger, the head of the German V2 rocket program, wrote after the war, "The Americans are a strange people. They build a device of infinite complexity, something that looks like a watchmaker's dream, and then they use it to kill a single infantryman in a muddy hole. We tried to build weapons to win battles. They built weapons to make winning inevitable." The VT Fuze was the ultimate expression of the Allied way of war. It was the triumph of silicon and glass over steel and courage. It proved that in the 20th century, you could not defeat a nation that could manufacture luck on an assembly line. The Germans had the best tanks, the Japanese had the most fanatical soldiers, but the Allies had the war forge. And in the end, the forge broke them all. This has been the story of the God of War. The story of how a light bulb in a bullet saved the world.